Howdy, everybody. Today we're going to talk about the difference between a fixer-upper and a forever truck. If there is a difference, I would think a fixer-upper would be like a throwaway truck that you're going to keep. That would be your typical Freightliner Cascadia that you would do an in-frame on and keep for a million point 2 miles or so, give or take a couple 100,000 miles. Um, a forever truck would be something like a fantasy truck. This is a truck, a forever truck is a truck that you always dreamed about having, driving, owning, you know, taking on as a project, but not just as a project it's in and of itself, but this is the truck that you're going to hold on for all of your career or most of your career. Um, I've seen some forever trucks, and typically they are, the quintessential Peterbilt 389 or the Kenworth W900. Think about trucks that are old. They are old, but they're still on the road, and they could be like pre-emission trucks. So guys hold on to them because they don't have all the after treatment systems that the modern trucks have. Um, they may have an old Caterpillar engine in it. Some of these trucks have very old engines, and some of these engines have had multiple overhauls. They've had two or three in frame or out of frame overhauls. These are forever trucks. These trucks have 2 to 3 million miles on them. You probably can't get that from a freight shaker unless it's a classic, for example. But there are guys out there that've been running these forever trucks 2 3 million miles. They do overhauls routinely every 500,000 miles or so. It used to be that an in-frame overhaul was somewhat routine and common for these older trucks. Um, they were pre-emissions, and you know it, it wasn't that big of a deal to do an in-frame. Nowadays we think it's a big deal. We think that an in-frame at 800,000 miles, you might as well just throw the truck away and get another one. But some of these older trucks, it was from my understanding, having talked to some drivers, uh, these these engines used to be overhauled routinely. And when you see some of these forever trucks and they got 2 million miles or 3 million miles, and they've had three overhauls or four overhauls, that was normal for those years of trucks. So there are guys out there who are driving these trucks, and some of these trucks, I think they're still on paper logs because they don't have the onboard diagnostic ports that these ELDs require. That's one of the reasons why they're forever trucks, because the guys want to keep running paper logs. They're willing to um, put the money in the trucks to keep them running. You know, some of these guys who are driving the Peterbilt 389, for example, they claim, I've never owned one, so I don't know, but they claim that they're built differently than some of these throwaway trucks, that the components are of higher quality and longer lasting, that they can go 2 million, 3 million miles. If you try to take a freight shaker 2 million miles, I mean, it'd probably fall apart. But they claim these other trucks can do it. So these are the forever trucks. Uh, these trucks probably only getting 5 or 6 miles per gallon. But if you got that kind of money where you bought it and then you're doing overhauls, you probably don't care about how much money you spend on fuel. you know, so these guys are well to do, and they probably have a lot of chrome on their trucks as well. These are the fantasy trucks. These are the trucks that you only dream about. So these guys got buku money. No matter how well off you are, how rich you are as a driver, some of these guys with forever trucks, they're very wealthy. We think, $100,000 is a good benchmark for success. These guys probably have $500,000 or more. So they got the money to throw at these trucks. Money's not an issue. It sounds strange to us because if we had that much money, we'd probably retire. But maybe these guys are in their 60s. Maybe they could retire, but because they have money, they can have these forever trucks. So when you think about building, building up a truck like a project truck, that's probably not your forever truck. If you take a high mileage truck that's not a Peterbilt 379, it's not a Kenworth W900, then it's more like a project truck. You're going to do an in-frame. You're going to run it a million, 2 million miles. That 1.2, 1.3 million miles. That'll be it. You extended the life of that Cascadia or that Mac or that International. But nothing beyond that. You wouldn't do more than one in-frame on those throwaway trucks. A forever truck, you would do multiple in-frame overhauls. You may replace the engine. You may put in a custom engine. If you had that kind of truck, you might even have a shop that you keep your truck in, and you may have extra parts for it. You may have an extra engine. These guys would be quite resourceful when it came to these forever trucks. They have the money. That's the thing. They're forever trucks. They're fantasy trucks. It's a whole different level. Most of us are driving to make a living. These guys aren't driving to make a living. They're driving because they enjoy it. You might see some of these forever trucks on the spot market. The guys on the spot market don't like ELDs. So if you had a forever truck, pre-emission truck, pre-ELD type truck, these trucks have to have some kind of like DOT exemption from keeping from using ELDs. They can only run on paper logs. That's how old these trucks are. But that's great for the guys on spot market. That's what they want because they have a lot more flexibility. Flexibility using the paper logs. So here you are, ELD. You're driving your Cascadia. You're complying with all the hours of service, and these guys aren't. They're on paper logs. They make it up as they go, and as a result, they probably generate more revenue, and they could put more money into their trucks. Does that mean you got to go out there and find one of these trucks and start doing that? You couldn't afford it. You couldn't afford one of those trucks. You couldn't afford to buy the fuel for the truck. You would have, before you even start entertaining the idea of having a forever truck or a fantasy truck, I would imagine your net worth would have to be around 200,000 or more. So that would be well into your career. You would probably be maybe at the 15-year point in your career before you can even entertain the idea of having a forever truck. So it's out of reach for most of us. Maybe towards the end of your career, you can start thinking about your forever truck, your dream truck, your fantasy truck. But for most of us, we may never in our entire driving career may never have a forever truck or one of these fantasy trucks. If you look at a brand new Peterbilt, I mean a brand new Peterbilt, that they're well over $200,000. They're like 250,000. Pushing towards $300,000 for a brand new one. That's what you're looking at as far as a forever truck or a fantasy truck, a high price truck, that is worth rebuilding multiple times. It's a truck that you would never sell. You would never recycle it. You would never sell it. And there would always be buyers for it too. So no matter what, no matter how many miles you got on it, 1 million, 2 million, there's probably guys out there willing to buy it from you. Because these trucks, they last longer than the throwaway trucks. But until you've got significant savings, like I said, probably closer around $200,000 net worth, you can't afford these trucks. So you're looking at a project truck at that point. You're like, you try to make the Cascadia as nice as you possibly can. you know, I've seen guys put chrome on a Cascadia. It's like lipstick on a pig. You know, still a pig. But they got their Cascadia all chromed out. They're trying to make it as nice as they possibly can, but it's still a Cascadia. I mean, come on. It's a throwaway truck. If you own one, you know the limitations. The Cascadia is not going to set the world on fire for looks. But if you had a forever truck, that'd be a different story. So uh, I think as new owner operator, I still believe as a brand new owner operator, your best bet is to buy a low mileage truck, 300 or 400,000 miles with a warranty. Don't even think about getting a forever truck. You can't afford it. Don't play in a game that you can't afford. Don't get out there and act like a big shot. You can't afford that Peterbilt 379 or 389. You just don't have the resources for it. You may want it. A lot of guys want it, but recognize with a little bit of humility where you're at in your career. You can't play that game, at least not yet. You don't have what it takes. It's not nothing against you personally, but your finances aren't strong enough to take on a forever truck. You may find some rusted old truck somewhere, and you think you're going to turn it into a forever truck. I've seen drivers do this. I mean, I look at that truck and they're like, "Oh yeah, I'm going to fix this up." I'm like, "Are you kidding me? That thing is, rusting like crazy." I wouldn't even think about fixing that truck up. But they got their sight on restoring it. And it take an ungodly amount of money in order to do that. You know, everybody's got their own financial situation. Maybe they got money that they're not telling you about. They're looking for some way to spend it. I can think of better ways to spend it. I can think of worse ways to spend it too. So uh, I think for the average rookie owner operator, go get you a truck with a warranty. Because as I said in previous videos, you don't know what you don't know. And what you don't know is how expensive owning a truck really is. A project truck is good for an owner operator who has experience. If you go out there as a rookie and buy a truck with 700,000 miles, you're setting yourself up for failure. What you don't realize, what you're getting yourself into. That truck is nearing a point where it needs to have an in-frame. If you don't have money saved up for maintenance, you buy that truck and you're just wasting your money. You'll be out of business 2 months later. It'll have a breakdown and you won't be able to afford to fix it. So go get yourself a truck with a warranty. That way you can at least stay in the game and you can build your finances. And someday in your career, when you got over 10 years or maybe 15 years experience and you want to take on a project truck, you can do that. And if you're really financially strong and you're fortunate in your investments and you want to drive your fantasy truck, maybe you can do that before you retire.
But for most of us, we'll never have the opportunity to have a forever truck. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the internet.